And now we're going to take a look at U.S. History Chapter 20, A Time of Social Change. In Section 1, we look at women and Native Americans fighting for change. The main idea is that in the 1960s, women and Native Americans struggled to achieve social justice. Our learning objectives are to summarize the goals of the women's liberation movement and to explain why and how Native Americans fought for change. So we start by looking at the women's liberation movement. The movement for women's rights had many different names: the women's liberation movement, the feminist movement, and the equal rights movement. A core belief of the women's liberation movement was feminism, the conviction that women and men should be socially, politically, and economically equal. Feminists cheered the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned discrimination in employment. Still, fighting gender-based discrimination was given low priority. The feminine mystique. In 1963, Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique stirred up women all across the country. Friedan found that many women had everything that they could want but still felt unfulfilled. The National Organization for Women, or NOW, fought gender discrimination in the workplace, schools, and the justice system. They lobbied government. They filed lawsuits, staged rallies, and marches. Betty Friedan and Polly Murray were major figures of NOW. One critic, though, was Phyllis Schlafly. The Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA, was something else that they tried to pass, and this promised equal treatment for men and women in all spheres, not just in employment. Some saw the ERA as a threat to family life. They felt it threatened the traditional role of women. This, of course, included Phyllis Schlafly and other conservatives that campaigned to defeat the ERA. The Roe v. Wade decision. This was a Supreme Court case that struck down state laws that banned abortion. And it argued that such laws violated a constitutional right to privacy. And it sparked a debate that continues to this day. Now looking at some of the successes and failures of the women's rights movement. The women's rights movement achieved many successes and failures as it fought for women's rights. In 1972, Congress passed the Educational Amendments. One of the sections, Title IX, prohibited federally funded schools from discriminating on the basis of gender in all areas, including academics and athletics. Title IX has become controversial because instead of increasing athletic opportunities for women, some colleges have used it as an excuse to cut opportunities for men. Now looking at the effects of the women's movement. The number of women holding professional jobs has increased. More women moved into senior positions in the government. More female politicians were elected to Congress. The feminist movement slowed its pace, though, in the late 1970s, and there was a perception that it only benefited wealthy white women. Now we begin to look at Native Americans in the early 1960s. As far as their living conditions, they did not share in the prosperity of the 1950s. They had the highest unemployment rates in the nation. The average income was less than half that of white American men, and they suffered disproportionately from poor health. And this brings us to the termination policy, which was a plan to draw Native Americans out of the isolated reservations and into mainstream society. The method used was to stop federal services to reservations and to relocate Native Americans to cities. The policy was a disaster. So this brings us now to a movement, or what kind of becomes known as the Red Power movement. In 1961, 700 Native Americans held a conference to oppose the termination policy. They drafted the Declaration of Indian Purpose, marking the beginning of the Red Power movement. President Johnson established the National Council on Indian Opportunity to get Native Americans more involved in setting policy regarding Indian affairs. Real change, however, came in the efforts of Native Americans, a Native American political activist. During the period of Red Power activism, Native Americans made important legislative gains. Congress passed laws that enhanced education, health care, voting rights, and religious freedom for Native Americans. Another thing that took place during this period was the occupation of Alcatraz. A group of Native Americans tried to reclaim Alcatraz Island. Now, of course, Alcatraz Island is a former prison located in the San Francisco Bay. And they claimed, the Native Americans that occupied it, claimed that the Treaty of Fort Laramie gave them the right to use any surplus federal territory. The occupation lasted for 18 months until federal marshals removed the group by force. The incident drew public attention to the plight of Native Americans. Partly as a result, New Mexico returned 48,000 acres of land to the Taos Pueblo in 1970. AIM. The American Indian Movement was founded in Minnesota in 1968, and it became the major force behind the Red Power movement. It called for a renewal of traditional cultures, economic independence, and better education for Indian children. Russell Means was one of AIM's best-known leaders. AIM sometimes used forceful tactics, such as the Trail of Broken Treaties and the occupation of Wounded Knee. Other organizations in the fight for fairness. The National Indian Education Association fought to improve access to education. Native American Rights Fund provided legal services. The Council on Energy Resource Tribes helped its member nations gain control over their natural resources and to choose whether to protect or develop them. These groups and others work to protect Native Americans' rights, improve standards of living, and do it all in a manner consistent with Native American conditions and traditions. Congress passed a number of laws in the 1970s to enhance education, healthcare, voting rights, and religious freedom for Native Americans. The Red Power movement instilled greater pride in Native Americans and generated wider appreciation of Native American culture. Despite these accomplishments, Native Americans continued to face many problems. Unemployment remained high, and the high school dropout rate among Native Americans was the highest in the nation. In this section, we're going to look at the Latinos' fight for rights. And the main idea is that in the 1960s, Latinos struggled to achieve social justice. Our learning objectives are to analyze the fight of Latinos for social justice. So looking at Latinos in the early 1960s, more than 900,000 Latinos lived in the United States in 1960. A Latino is any person of Latin American descent. 1/3 of Mexican American families live below the poverty line, and twice as many Mexican Americans as white Americans were unemployed. Latinos faced discrimination in education. Schools had less qualified teachers, fewer resources, and shabbier facilities. Few teachers were able to speak Spanish. In politics, Latinos had far less power. In politics, Latinos had far less power than the size of their population warranted. Electoral district boundaries kept Latino votes scattered. The number of Latinos in political office was very small, and Latinos were often excluded from serving on juries. Latinos sought social justice, which is the fair distribution of advantages and disadvantages in society. Some examples included the Delano grape strike, where migrant agricultural workers, many of whom were Latino, received low wages for backbreaking labor. In 1965, Filipino farm workers went on strike in Delano, California. The National Farm Workers Association soon joined them. One major leader was Cesar Chavez. He co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, a union of Mexican American farm workers. His leadership inspired many Mexican Americans to fight discrimination in their lives. And now let's take a closer look at the Delano grape strike. So once again, in 1965, Filipino farm workers went on strike and demanded a 15-cent increase in their hourly wage. Dolores Huerta and Cesar Chavez agreed to help. Some 5,000 grape workers walked off their jobs. The Delano grape strike lasted for 5 years. Strikers picketed the fields. Chavez led a 250-mile march to the state capitol. and Huerta sent union activists around the nation to set up local boycott committees. Union activists and sympathetic volunteers stood in front of grocery stores nationwide, urging Americans not to buy grapes. The growers finally gave in and finally settled with the union. The success of the strike made Cesar Chavez a national figure. The Chicano movement. This Chicano was a shortened version of Mexicanos. They wanted to convey ethnic pride and commitment to political activism. Reyes Lopez Tiarina was an early Chicano leader who formed Alianza Federal de Mercedes, or the Federal Alliance of Land Grants. Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez was another leading figure in the Chicano movement, and he founded the Crusade for Justice. A group of college students in Texas formed the Mexican Youth Organization, or MAYO, and Jose Angel Gutierrez founded La Raza Unida Party, or the RUP. Working class Chicano students in Los Angeles formed the Brown Berets, which was one of the most militant groups in the Chicano movement. So looking at Alianza, Reyes Lopez Tiarina focused on the enduring issue of land rights. Despite the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, Mexican Americans had lost thousands of acres over the years. Now we look at the Crusade for Justice. Once again, Rodolfo Corky Gonzalez promoted Mexican American nationalism. He provided legal aid and a theater for cultural awareness, a Spanish newspaper, and other community services. And he sponsored the National Chicano Liberation Youth Conference. And now we look at Mayo. Jose Angel Gutierrez wanted to achieve economic independence for Mexican Americans, gain local control over the education of Hispanic children, and a third political party. He organized school walkouts and mass demonstrations in Crystal City, Texas. And it was involved in forming La Raza Unida. Gutierrez formed the RUP, meaning the United People Party. They campaigned for bilingual education, improved public services, education for children of migrant workers, and an end to job discrimination. The RUP candidates were elected to offices in several Texas cities. The RUP expanded to Colorado and even other parts of the Southwest. Disagreements, though, among RUP leaders caused the party to fall apart in the late 1970s. And now we look at the Brown Berets, one of the most militant organizations in the Chicano movement. They began by protesting against police brutality or violence in East Los Angeles. They fought for bilingual education, better school conditions, Chicano studies, and more Chicano teachers. Supported efforts of Chicanos to regain their historic lands, the National Farm Workers campaigns, and protested the high number of Chicano deaths in Vietnam. They disbanded in 1972. And now we will look at the Boricua movement. This is the name by which many Puerto Ricans refer to themselves, and it expresses ethnic pride and support for political activism. Many Puerto Ricans migrated to the United States after World War II. Immigrants experienced social and economic discrimination. The movement's goals shifted from self-government for Puerto Rico to better conditions for all Puerto Ricans. The Young Lords was a militant Boricua organization, and Taller Boricua was a community arts organization. Cuban Americans. Many well-to-do Cubans fled Castro's communist government for the United States. The majority of immigrants were professionals and business people. Most Cuban Americans who organized for change were seeking changes for Cuba, such as the overthrow of Castro and of communism. In the next section, we're going to look at the culture and the counterculture. The main idea is that the counterculture that emerged in the 1960s and in the 1970s left a lasting impact on American life. Our learning objectives is to analyze the counterculture movement's rise, fall, and lasting legacy. The counterculture of the 1960s was a rebellion of teens and young adults against mainstream American society. Young Americans believed that society's values were hollow and its priorities were misplaced. They called the mainstream the establishment, and they wanted to create an alternative culture based on peace and love. So, where did the counterculture come from? Well, the number of teens and young adults in the United States rose dramatically in the 1960s. Of course, this is because they were members of the baby boom generation, this large generation born after the end of World War II. These young people were living in turbulent times. They had to deal with the threat of nuclear war, racial discrimination and segregation, the Vietnam War, and environmental pollution. Rebellion against the dominant culture was not new. The Beat generation of the 1950s questioned traditional values, challenged authority, and experimented with nonconformist lifestyles. We also saw rising student activism. Students on college campuses began rebelling against school policies that they considered restrictive, unjust, or just not relevant. At the University of California at Berkeley, students protested when school officials banned speech-making and political organizing at the entrances to campus. The events at Berkeley marked the beginning of the free speech movement, which swept campuses across the nation. The students used the tactics of civil disobedience to protest injustices. Mainstream Americans were shocked as they expected young people not to question authority. Thousands of teens and young adults left school, jobs, and traditional home life as a part of the counterculture. They rejected materialism and the work ethic of the older generation. And the Haight-Ashbury district, which is a neighborhood in San Francisco located at the intersections of Haight and Ashbury streets, becomes the center of the counterculture movement. Looking at hippie culture, they sought new experiences. Eastern religions, astrology, the occult, and illegal drugs were all associated with it. Typically, they wore very casual and colorful clothing. Men began wearing longer hair, beards, and afros. And commonly, many of them were referred to as flower children. And of course, that's largely because many of them were known to wear flowers in their hair. Their decline came really kind of after the summer of 1967, which really was the height of the hippie movement. And that was known as the Summer of Love. Freedoms that they took oftentimes led to problems with addiction. Also, many in the counterculture found themselves with no way really to support themselves, and a lack of rules led to conflicts. As far as spirituality, as the counterculture members rejected materialism, many embraced spirituality, including a broad range of beliefs that included astrology, magic, Eastern religions, and new forms of Christianity. Two new religious groups of this time were the Unification Church and the Hare Krishna movement. Now we look at mainstream reactions to the counterculture. Some observers of the counterculture were put off by the unkempt appearance of hippies. On a deeper level, many mainstream Americans objected to the unconventional values of the counterculture. They saw hippies as disrespectful, uncivilized, and threatening. To many in the establishment, it appeared that society was unraveling. The television show All in the Family highlighted the older generation's distrust of the counterculture and the younger generation's desire to change society, and particularly illustrated in two of the characters. Carol O'Connor played Archie Bunker, the main character in All in the Family, and Archie is extremely conservative and very narrow-minded and very hostile, particularly towards his son-in-law, Mike, who he refers to as Meathead. And Mike and Archie's daughter Gloria, they're part of more the counterculture movement, embracing these challenges to society. And so, a lot of the show's humor plays off of the conflict between these differing values. the counterculture really declined in part due to illicit drug use. Some became addicted to drugs, and others died from drug overdoses. Some hippie communities became involved with criminal activities, the most notorious of which was Charlie Manson and his followers, who were responsible for the Tate LaBianca murders. Now we look at the legacy of the counterculture. Americans became more casual in the way that they dressed, more open-minded about lifestyles and social behavior, and attitudes about sexual behavior loosened. People explored topics that were once taboo. As far as art and film, a new style emerged called pop art. It aimed to appeal to popular taste. Andy Warhol led the movement. Film broadened its subject matter as censorship rules relaxed, and the film industry adopted a rating system that we're now very familiar with. Early on, it was G, which was for general audiences, PG, which was for parental guidance, and R, which was restricted. And then also they had X or XXX films, which were for adults. But we've since seen additional ratings added, particularly the PG-13. And then also there was a period of time where we saw movies that were rated NC-17, which was kind of worse than R. So, but the whole rating system initially, the G, PG, and R, really came into effect during this time frame. As far as music, the Beatles brought new techniques and ideas to rock and roll. Bob Dylan wrote political songs and became the spokesman for his generation. And Woodstock was a music and arts fair that was a celebration of an era. And this was held in 1969, so slightly past the peak of the counterculture movement, but nonetheless a huge musical celebration. And now we're going to look at the environmentalism and the consumer movement. The main idea is that in the 1960s and 1970s saw the beginning of environmentalism and the consumer movement. Our learning objectives are to analyze the arguments for and against environmentalism and to summarize the history of the consumer movement. So we start by looking at Rachel Carson. She was a marine biologist, and she wrote a book called Silent Spring in which she warned of the increasing risk by the use of pesticides that were designed to kill insects. She said they were killing birds and fish as well. The environmental issues of the 1960s included logging in the Northwest, smog, air pollution from factories and cars in the cities, pollution and garbage in Lake Erie, and an oil spill off the California coast. On April 22nd, 1970, we had the first Earth Day. That was held to focus on environmental problems in the United States. And it led to the formation of other groups like the Sierra Club and the Audubon Society. We also saw the creation of the EPA in 1970 when President Nixon signed the Environmental Protection Policy Act, creating the EPA. It took on the job of setting and enforcing pollution standards. The Clean Air Act of 1970 established emission standards for automobiles and factories. Critics, though, claim that environmental regulations are harmful to business and the economy. The Clean Water Act of 1972 is the primary federal law regulating water pollution. The Endangered Species Act of 1973 was designed to protect critically imperiled species from extinction as a consequence of economic growth and development untempered by adequate concern and conservation. Love Canal. This is a neighborhood in Niagara Falls, New York, where 21,000 tons of toxic waste that had been buried beneath the neighborhood by a chemical company. Now, of course, when they sold this area, they didn't really intend that homes would be built on it, but ultimately that's what happened. Eventually, the government relocated more than 800 families and reimbursed them for their homes. 3 Mile Island. Nuclear energy was debated because supporters argued that it was cleaner than fossil fuels like coal and oil, but critics worried about the dangers of an accidental radiation release. On March 28, 1979, one of the reactors at the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility overheated, causing low levels of radiation to escape. The incident added to the fears of radiation, even though the plant was determined to be safe. The consumer movement. Consumers demanded safer products and accurate information during the 1960s and 1970s. Ralph Nader became the leader of the consumer protection movement. Nader first criticized the automobile industry in an article that he wrote in 1959 called "The Safe Car That You Can't Buy." Nader's efforts resulted in the passage of the National Traffic and Motor Safety Act in 1966. Nader became a leader in the push to protect the public from dangerous toys, flammable fabrics, and other hazardous consumer goods.